Valve just confirmed it is working directly with NVIDIA to bring official SteamOS support to desktop PCs with GeForce graphics cards. And the Steam Machine, Valve's new living room gaming PC, ships on June 29th for a starting price of $1,049. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another Linux gaming announcement. Another. This time, it's different. And honestly, you'd be right to be skeptical. We've been here before. But here's what's different this time. This isn't a third-party distro trying to make Linux gaming work. This is Valve, the company that controls the largest PC gaming platform on the planet, officially partnering with NVIDIA. The company that makes the GPU, sitting in roughly 60% of gaming PCs, to make SteamOS a first-class citizen on desktop hardware. So today we're going to break down exactly what was announced, what it actually means in practice, and critically, what it does not mean. Because there's a lot of hype flying around right now, and some of it is justified and some of it is not. Here's what we're going to cover. We'll look at exactly what Valve and NVIDIA announced and what the timeline actually looks like. We'll dig into why NVIDIA support on Linux has historically been such a mess and why this collaboration matters. We'll look at the Steam Machine hardware itself and whether that price is justified. Then we'll get into what SteamOS on a general desktop PC actually means for you, whether you're a gamer, a Linux enthusiast, or an IT professional. And we'll close with the bigger picture question. Is this the moment Linux gaming crosses the line from niche to mainstream? One question I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this. If SteamOS becomes a default gaming OS for living room PCs, what happens to the Linux desktop market share number that just crossed 4% on Steam? Because the answer to that question might surprise you. Let's start with what was actually announced and separate the confirmed facts from the speculation. Chapter 2 of 12. What was actually announced? The facts. Let's be precise about what was and wasn't announced, because the reporting has been all over the place. What is confirmed, Valve's Pierre-Luc Griffet, one of the lead engineers behind the Steam Deck, publicly stated that Valve has a growing team working on NVIDIA driver support for SteamOS. He said, and I'm quoting directly here, "We're collaborating with NVIDIA very closely." That is a direct, on-the-record statement from a Valve engineer. What is also confirmed, Valve is making SteamOS compatible with more desktop hardware beyond the Steam Deck. The Steam Machine, a new living room gaming PC, ships June 29th at $1,049 for the base model with a 512GB SSD. It's reservation only at launch, meaning you can't just walk into a store and buy one. What is not confirmed, a specific release date for NVIDIA SteamOS drivers for the general public. Most reporting puts the earliest realistic timeline at late 2026, and some analysts are saying it could slip into 2027. Valve has not committed to a date. So if you're sitting there with an NVIDIA GPU thinking you can install SteamOS next week, that's not where we are. Here's the current state of play. If you have an AMD GPU, SteamOS already works on your desktop PC today. The Intel GPU support has also been improved. The NVIDIA gap is the missing piece, and it's the most important piece because NVIDIA dominates the discrete GPU market. There's also a dual boot hint buried in the reporting. Valve hinted at dual boot capabilities coming in the future, meaning you could potentially have a PC that boots into SteamOS for gaming and Windows for everything else. That's not confirmed either, but it's an interesting signal. So to summarize the confirmed facts. Valve and NVIDIA are collaborating. SteamOS is being expanded to desktop hardware. The Steam Machine ships June 29th. NVIDIA driver support for the general public is coming, but not imminently. Now, to understand why this matters, we need to talk about why NVIDIA on Linux has been such a persistent problem. Chapter 3 of 12. Why NVIDIA on Linux has always been a problem. If you have been in the Linux world for more than 5 minutes, you have probably heard someone complain about NVIDIA drivers. And if you're newer to Linux, you might be wondering why this is even a conversation. Is not a driver just a driver? The short answer is no. And understanding why is important context for why this Valve collaboration is a bigger deal than it might appear. Linux is open source, built by the community. The kernel, the core of the operating system, is developed publicly, with contributions from thousands of engineers around the world. When the kernel changes, open source drivers update alongside it, because the people maintaining those drivers can see exactly what changed and why. NVIDIA's drivers, historically, have been proprietary, closed source, black box. When the Linux kernel changes something that NVIDIA's driver depends on, NVIDIA has to update their driver internally, test it, and release it. That process takes time. And in the meantime, you might end up with a system where a kernel update breaks your GPU driver. Now, NVIDIA has been moving in a better direction. In 2022, they released open source kernel modules. In 2022, they released open source kernel modules for their newer GPUs. That was a significant shift. But the full driver stack, the part that handles gaming, compute, and display, is still largely proprietary. The deeper issue for SteamOS specifically is that SteamOS is a curated, controlled operating system. Valve manages the kernel version, the driver stack, the update cadence. For SteamOS to work reliably on NVIDIA hardware, Valve needs a level of collaboration with NVIDIA that simply has not existed before. A direct line to NVIDIA's driver team, the ability to test against specific driver versions, and ideally some influence over the driver development roadmap. That is what collaborating very closely actually means. It is not just NVIDIA gave Valve access to some documentation. It is an engineering partnership. And that is why this announcement matters. Not because NVIDIA drivers on Linux are suddenly going to be perfect. They will not be, at least not immediately. But because for the first time, Valve has the resources, the motivation, and now apparently the NVIDIA relationship to make this work properly. The question is, what does work properly actually look like? And what is the experience going to be for someone who buys a Steam machine or tries to install SteamOS on their existing PC? Chapter 4 of 12. The Steam machine. $1,049. For what exactly? Let's talk about the hardware. The Steam machine starts at $1,049 for the base model. That gets you a 512GB SSD. It ships June 29th, but it's reservation only, meaning Valve is controlling the initial supply and you can't just order one and expect it to arrive on launch day. Now, $1,049 is a number that's going to generate a lot of reactions. And I think it's worth putting it in context before we make a judgment either way. A PlayStation 5 retails for around $500. An Xbox Series X is similar. So at first glance, $1,049 for a gaming box seems expensive. But the Steam machine is not trying to compete with consoles directly. It's a PC. It runs SteamOS, which means it has access to the Steam library, roughly 30,000 games that have been verified or are playable on SteamOS. That's a completely different value proposition than a console with a curated library of exclusives. The more relevant comparison is a mid-range gaming PC. And here, the $1,049 starting price is actually competitive, depending on what's inside the box. Valve hasn't fully disclosed the internal specs of the base model beyond the SSD capacity, which is frustrating. But based on the Steam Deck's track record, we can expect Valve to have optimized the hardware and software together, which is exactly what Apple does with their silicon, and exactly why Apple Silicon Macs perform so well. The reservation-only launch is also worth noting. Valve did the same thing with the Steam Deck, and it was a deliberate strategy to manage supply, gather early feedback, and avoid the kind of launch day disaster that plagued the PS5 and Xbox Series X. If you want one on day one, you need to reserve now. Here's the open question I want to plant for later. The Steam machine runs SteamOS. SteamOS is a Linux distribution, which means that every person who buys a Steam machine is, whether they know it or not, a Linux user. And Valve is about to ship a lot of Steam machines. What does that do to the Linux market share number? We'll come back to that. But first, let's talk about what SteamOS on a general desktop PC actually looks like. Because this is where things get interesting for the Linux community specifically. Chapter 5 of 12. SteamOS on your existing PC. What it actually means. So let's say you don't want to buy a Steam machine. You already have a gaming PC. Maybe it's got an AMD GPU. Maybe it's got an NVIDIA card. Can you install SteamOS on it? The answer right now is, it depends. If you have an AMD GPU, SteamOS already works on desktop hardware today. Valve has been expanding AMD compatibility as part of the broader push to support more than just the Steam Deck. Intel GPU support has also improved significantly. The NVIDIA gap is the piece that's still being worked on. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. SteamOS is not a general-purpose Linux desktop. It's a gaming appliance operating system. When you boot into SteamOS, you get the big picture interface. The same interface you see on the Steam Deck. It's designed to be used with a controller from the couch on a TV. It's not designed to be your daily driver for web browsing, document editing, or software development. Now you can switch to a desktop mode in SteamOS. It runs KDE Plasma underneath. So technically, you can use it as a desktop, but that's not the primary use case Valve is designing for. This is actually a really important distinction for the Linux community. SteamOS is not Fedora. It's not Ubuntu. It's not even Bazzite, which is the community-built gaming distro that's been doing this for a while. SteamOS is a locked-down, immutable operating system that Valve controls completely. You don't get to install random packages, you don't get to customize a kernel, you get a stable, optimized gaming experience. And that's it. For gamers, that's probably fine. For Linux enthusiasts who want control over their system, it might feel limiting. And that's okay. Those are different audiences with different needs. The interesting question is what this means for Bazzite, ChimeraOS, and the other community-built gaming distros. Because if Valve is now officially supporting SteamOS on desktop hardware, does that eat into their audience? Or does it actually validate the whole category and bring more people into the Linux gaming ecosystem? By the way, I just checked our channel analytics, and it turns out about 65% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet. If you've been getting value from these Linux deep dives, hitting that subscribe button is the best free way to support the channel and make sure you never miss the next one. Let's talk about those community distros, because their story is actually central to understanding what Valve is doing here. Before Valve announced official SteamOS support for desktop hardware, the Linux gaming community had already solved this problem themselves. Bazzite is probably the most well-known example. It is an immutable Linux distribution based on Fedora Atomic, built specifically for gaming, and it supports a much wider range of hardware than official SteamOS, including NVIDIA GPUs, right now, today. ChimeraOS is another one. It has been around even longer, and it is specifically designed for the living room gaming PC use case. The exact same use case as the Steam machine. So when Valve announces they are expanding SteamOS to desktop hardware, the natural question is, what happens to these projects? Do they become redundant? I do not think so, and here's why. First, Bazzite and ChimeraOS already support NVIDIA. Official SteamOS NVIDIA support is still months away at minimum. If you have an NVIDIA GPU and you want a gaming-focused Linux experience right now, Bazzite is your answer. Second, Bazzite is more flexible. It is built on Fedora Atomic, which means you get access to a much larger software ecosystem. You can install Flatpaks, you can use DistroBox to run containers with different distributions inside them. It is a gaming OS that also works as a general-purpose desktop. Third, the community distros have been iterating faster than Valve. They have been adding features, fixing bugs, and responding to user feedback on a timeline that a company the size of Valve simply cannot match. What I think actually happens is that official SteamOS expansion validates the entire category. It tells hardware manufacturers, game developers, and consumers that Linux gaming on desktop PCs is a real thing that a major company is investing in. That rising tide lifts all boats, including Bazzite and ChimeraOS. There's also a practical consideration for the Linux community. Valve's resources are enormous. If Valve is putting a growing team on NVIDIA driver support for SteamOS, that work will benefit the entire Linux ecosystem, not just SteamOS. Better NVIDIA drivers on Linux are better NVIDIA drivers on Linux. Full stop. Now, let's talk about the gaming side of this more specifically. Because there is a claim floating around that the Steam machine will launch with 30,000 playable games. And I want to look at that number carefully. 30,000 games. That's the number being cited for how many games will be playable on the Steam machine at launch. And it's a compelling number. Steam has over 50,000 games in its library. 30,000 playable on Linux is a significant portion. But let's be precise about what playable means here, because it's doing a lot of work in that sentence. Valve has a tiered rating system for Steam Deck and SteamOS compatibility. Verified means the game works perfectly with the controller interface and has been tested by Valve. Playable means it works, but might require some configuration. Maybe you need to use a keyboard for certain menus, or the text is a bit small. Unsupported means it doesn't work, usually because of anti-cheat software or other compatibility issues. When people say 30,000 games are playable, they're combining the verified and playable tiers. Which is fair, most of those games will genuinely work. But it's not the same as saying 30,000 games are perfectly optimized for the Steam machine experience. The technology making this possible is Proton, Valve's compatibility layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux. Proton is built on Wine, but Valve has invested heavily in it, adding their own patches, integrating DXVK for DirectX translation, and maintaining a compatibility database called ProtonDB, where users report which games work. Proton has gotten remarkably good. Games that would have been completely broken on Linux 5 years ago now run at near native performance. But there are still categories of games that don't work well. Anti-cheat is the biggest one. And that's actually where the Epic Games story becomes relevant. We'll come back to that. The other category that struggles is games with aggressive DRM, digital rights management. Some DRM systems don't play well with Proton's compatibility layer. This is a smaller issue than it used to be, but it still exists. So the honest answer to how many games can I play on the Steam machine is a lot. More than on any console. But not every game in your Steam library. And the games that don't work are often the ones you most want to play. The big multiplayer titles with anti-cheat. Which brings us to a question I've been holding back since the beginning of this video. What about the games that still don't work? What's actually being done about the anti-cheat problem? Chapter 8 of 12. Anti-cheat, the last frontier for Linux gaming. Here is something that happened in the last week that did not get nearly enough attention alongside the SteamOS announcement. Epic Games posted job listings specifically for Linux Easy Anti-Cheat developers. EAC is the anti-cheat system used by Fortnite and hundreds of other games. And it has been one of the primary reasons those games do not work on Linux. Companies do not hire for problems they are not planning to solve. Now, Epic has not made any official announcement. They have not said Fortnite is coming to Steam Deck. But this is a very clear signal. Hiring engineers specifically to work on Linux EAC support shows exactly the direction they are heading. The anti-cheat problem on Linux is actually a technical one, not a philosophical one. Most systems run at a very low level on the operating system. On Windows, this is straightforward. On Linux, it is complicated, because Proton creates a translation layer that anti-cheat systems often flag as suspicious. EAC already has a Linux compatibility mode, but it essentially disables the kernel level capabilities. That is not a real solution. What Epic appears to be working on is a proper Linux native implementation that works correctly with the Linux kernel. The timing here is not a coincidence. Valve is expanding SteamOS to desktop hardware. The Linux gaming market share just crossed 4%. Epic Games is watching that number. Fortnite is one of the most played games in the world. If it works on Linux, that is a massive unlock. BattlEye already has a Linux compatible mode that works reasonably well. Riot Games Vanguard is still a problem, but the trend is positive. From an IT professional perspective, this is interesting. Anti-cheat software that runs at kernel level is essentially a rootkit. Redesigning these systems for the auditable Linux kernel environment is actually a security improvement, not just a gaming one. The convergence of the SteamOS expansion and the Epic Games anti-cheat work is not coincidental. These are responses to the same shift. Linux gaming is becoming too big to ignore. Subscribe for more deep dives into the 2026 tech landscape. I want to take a step back from the gaming angle for a moment and look at this from an IT professional's perspective. Because I've been in IT for over 25 years, and I think there's a dimension to this story that most gaming-focused coverage is missing. SteamOS is an immutable operating system. That means the root file system is read-only. You can't accidentally break it by installing the wrong package. Updates are atomic. They either apply completely or they don't apply at all. And you can roll back if something goes wrong. From a systems management perspective, that's actually a very attractive property. Now, I'm not suggesting that enterprises should deploy SteamOS as a workstation OS. That's not what it's designed for. But the underlying architecture, immutable, atomic updates, managed by a central vendor, is the same architecture that's being adopted by enterprise Linux distributions like RHEL and Fedora Atomic. The more interesting enterprise question is about gaming rooms and entertainment spaces. Hotels, airports, gaming cafes, corporate entertainment facilities. These are environments where you want a gaming PC that's reliable, easy to manage, and doesn't require a full-time IT administrator to maintain. SteamOS on the Steam machine is actually a compelling solution for those use cases. There's also a security angle. The Steam machine runs SteamOS, which is Linux. Linux has a significantly smaller attack surface than Windows for most malware. It doesn't run Windows executables natively. It doesn't have the same exposure to the Windows malware ecosystem that dominates the threat landscape. For a gaming device that's going to be used in a semi-public environment, that's a meaningful security advantage. And from a support perspective, as someone who has spent decades managing Windows environments, the idea of a gaming device that Valve manages, updates and supports with a lockdown OS that can't be accidentally broken by users is genuinely appealing. It's the same reason why Chromebooks became popular in education. Simplicity and manageability have real value. I'm not saying the Steam machine is going to replace enterprise workstations. It's not. But the convergence of Linux gaming maturity and immutable OS architecture is creating something interesting. A category of Linux device that's reliable enough for non-technical users and secure enough for IT professionals to be comfortable with. That's a genuinely new thing. And it matters beyond gaming. Chapter 10. Linux gaming at 4%. What the number actually means. Let's come back to that market share question I raised at the beginning. Linux just crossed 4% on the Steam hardware survey. That might sound small, but let me put it in context. Steam has roughly 130 million monthly active users. 4% of 130 million is 5.2 million Linux gamers on Steam. That's not a niche, that's a significant user base. And here's the thing about that 4% number. It only counts people who are actively using Steam on Linux. It doesn't count Steam Deck users who are playing in handheld mode. Those are counted separately. It doesn't count people who use SteamOS on a TV without ever opening the desktop. The actual Linux gaming population is larger than the survey suggests. Now at the Steam machine. Valve is about to ship a device that runs SteamOS Linux to living rooms. Every Steam machine sold is a Linux gaming device. And Valve is not a small company. The Steam Deck sold millions of units. If the Steam machine is even half as successful, that's millions more Linux gaming devices in homes. There's a fascinating paradox here. The Steam machine might actually cause the Linux market share percentage to drop temporarily, even as the absolute number of Linux gamers increases. Because SteamOS devices don't necessarily show up in the hardware survey the same way. Because SteamOS devices in living room mode don't necessarily show up the same way a desktop installation does. The survey counts desktop sessions, not all gaming sessions. But the absolute number is what matters for game developers. If there are 10 million Linux gamers on Steam, which is plausible within the next 2 years, that's a market that game developers cannot ignore. That's the size of some entire gaming platforms. The question I keep coming back to is this. At what point does a Linux gaming market become large enough that game developers start targeting it natively, rather than relying on Proton compatibility? Because that's the real inflection point. When games are developed with Linux as a first-class target, the compatibility issues largely disappear. We're not there yet, but the trajectory is pointing in that direction. And the Valve-NVIDIA collaboration is one of the most significant steps toward the future that we've seen. Stay tuned as we continue to track this shift. I'll see you in the next chapter. Let's zoom out one more time and talk about the ripple effects of this announcement beyond gaming. Because the Valve-NVIDIA collaboration does not just affect SteamOS. It affects the entire Linux ecosystem. The most direct effect is on NVIDIA driver quality for Linux broadly. When Valve and NVIDIA collaborate on driver support for SteamOS, they are working on the same driver stack that affects every Linux distribution. Better NVIDIA drivers on SteamOS means better NVIDIA drivers on Ubuntu, Fedora, Arch, and everything else. The engineering work does not stay siloed inside SteamOS. The second effect is on hardware vendor attention. When a company the size of Valve commits to Linux on desktop hardware, it sends a signal to other hardware vendors. GPU manufacturers, peripheral makers, laptop vendors, they all watch what Valve does. If NVIDIA is investing engineering resources in Linux driver quality because of Valve, that changes the calculus for other vendors too. The third effect is on game developers. We talked about this briefly, but it is worth emphasizing. When the Linux gaming market reaches a critical mass, game developers start testing on Linux. They start fixing Linux-specific bugs. They start considering Linux as a launch platform rather than an afterthought. That is already happening with some studios. But the Steam machine and SteamOS expansion accelerates it. And the fourth effect, and this is the one I find most interesting from a long-term perspective, is on the Linux desktop itself. Every person who buys a Steam machine and has a positive experience is a potential convert to Linux on the desktop. Not everyone will make that leap, but some will. And those people will bring their friends, their family members, their colleagues. The Steam Deck already demonstrated this effect. There are thousands of people who bought a Steam Deck, discovered that it ran Linux, got curious, and ended up installing Arch or Fedora on their main PC. The Steam machine will do the same thing, but for a much larger audience. People who want a living room gaming PC, not a handheld. Now, there's one more question we have not addressed yet. And it is the one that a lot of Linux veterans are probably thinking about right now. What does this mean for Windows? Is this the beginning of the end for Windows as the default gaming OS? That is a bigger question than it might seem. And the answer is more nuanced than either the Linux is taking over crowd or the Windows will always dominate crowd wants to admit. Is this the end of Windows as the dominant gaming OS? The honest answer is not yet. And probably not for a long time. But the direction of travel has changed. Windows still has enormous advantages. It has near universal game compatibility. It has decades of driver support. It has the familiarity of 1 billion users. Game developers still test on Windows first. Anti-cheat systems are still primarily designed for Windows. None of that disappears overnight. But here's what has changed. For the first time, there is a credible, well-funded, commercially backed alternative to Windows for gaming. Not a hobbyist project, not a community effort, a product from Valve backed by a direct engineering partnership with NVIDIA, shipping hardware on June 29th. The Windows 10 end-of-life deadline in October 2025 already pushed a significant number of users to look at alternatives. Some went to Windows 11, some went to Linux. The Steam machine gives those Linux-curious users a clear, simple answer. Here is a Linux device that plays your games, works out of the box, and doesn't require you to learn anything new. What I think actually happens over the next 2 to 3 years is not that Linux replaces Windows for gaming, it's that Linux becomes a viable second platform, the way macOS is a viable second platform for productivity. Not everyone's first choice, but a legitimate option that a meaningful percentage of users choose deliberately. And from a Linux community perspective, that's actually a better outcome than Linux takes over. A world where Linux has 10 to 50% of the gaming market means better drivers, better game support, better hardware compatibility, and a healthier ecosystem for everyone, including the people who use Linux on the desktop for reasons that have nothing to do with gaming. The Valve-NVIDIA collaboration is not a revolution, it's an evolution. A significant, well-resourced, commercially motivated evolution, but an evolution nonetheless. The Linux gaming story has been building for years. The Steam Deck proved the concept. The Steam machine is the next step. And the NVIDIA collaboration is the piece that makes it viable for the majority of gaming PCs. If you want to stay on top of where this goes next, and there is a lot more to come, especially once NVIDIA support actually ships, make sure you're subscribed. Like this video if it gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening here. And if you want to support the channel directly and get some cool perks, consider clicking the join button below to become a pseudo user or get root access. It makes a real difference.